All right. So y'all bear with me. I am still not feeling very well. I was diagnosed with strep on Tuesday. I've been on antibiotic for since Tuesday. So I'm not contagious anymore, but I'm still not feeling well at all. My plan had been to do an outline and have it ready Wednesday night to pass out so that we don't have to read the book. We can just kind of go in an overview and then cover maybe some of the discussion questions and so forth. So, but what we're going to do today is, since I wasn't here Wednesday night, we're going to finish chapter 1, reading through it, discussing after each paragraph. But then starting next Sunday, instead of reading the chapter, we'll just assume everybody's read it. And then what we'll do is we'll just kind of do an overview, like of chapter 2, the need for apologetics. We'll do an overview, and then we'll cover discussion questions, and there might be some extra questions in there as well. But I'll have an outline printed and put on the table in the foyer, so that next Sunday, just so everybody's aware, I wanted to give everybody a heads up before we did it, that we won't be reading through it starting next Sunday with chapter 2. But our plan for today is to finish chapter 1 and then go through the discussion questions. So right now we're kind of right in the middle of chapter 1. We're at the part in page 15 in chapter 1 that says, "What is biblical faith?" And this is where the author, Doy Moyer, where he starts taking the principles of faith or belief and applying it to what the Bible says, and then extrapolating the concept of evidence-based faith, which is what the Bible teaches. So, starting on page 15, at the bottom on the right-hand side there, at the bottom or on the bottom part of the page, the common idea about faith is that it is belief without evidence, or believing something in spite of the evidence. This makes faith sound unreasonable, blind, and gullible. If the world can represent faith like that, then no wonder people want to avoid faith. No one wants to be unreasonable and gullible. Sadly, the world has been able to abuse the concept of faith in this way, and it has resulted in serious misunderstandings about God, Jesus, the Scriptures, and the overall nature of faith. And that is the case, and in fact, you look at some of these forums and some of these, you read some of these religious articles and kind of look at the comments and how faith is stupid and people believe in nothing with no reason and that sort of thing. And that's how sometimes religious or biblical faith is perceived by people in the world. That's not the way biblical faith is to work. Everyone exercises faith in something. No one is exempt from having faith, and that includes atheists who believe that nature alone is capable of producing the universe and the living conditions of the earth. This philosophy of naturalism is not by any stretch of the imagination a proven scientific fact. It is a faith. In fact, this is one of the reasons why sometimes we talk about macroevolution, that is the evolution of one species turning into another. Microevolution is variation within a species, and that's obvious. Variations within a species does take place. Macroevolution is monkeys turning into human beings. And the concept of evolution, or even the Big Bang, is being presented as fact. But what is a fact? What differentiates a fact from a hypothesis, and a hypothesis from a theory? Yes, ma'am.
A hypothesis is a guess. Fact is something that can be proven.
Okay.
That chair is solid.
Okay.
And we have a common definition between solid and liquid, right?
All right.
So it's that gravity is gravity. You can't see it, but it's gravity.
All right. So it's interesting because you've got facts which are provable and testable, right? A hypothesis is an idea that you could test to prove. So what's a theory?
It's the way you believe something might happen, but you can't prove it.
You can't test it, or it has yet to be tested. Okay? Thus, evolution, far from being a fact, isn't even a hypothesis because you can't test macroevolution.
The thing about a fact that's important to remember is it can be tested, but it's repeatable results.
It's repeatable results. That's exactly right. And can we repeat macroevolution? Can we even show macroevolution has actually taken place? Do we currently have one species turning into another species? No. No. In fact, scientists explain that we're in a lull of evolution right now because there's no current and intra-species changes taking place. But the fact of the matter is, it's a theory that scientists infer from archaeology, from facts as they perceive them. Of course, we interpret the facts as supporting the Bible. They interpret the facts as supporting evolution and myriad of other things. But on the basis of that, can you prove that God exists? Is there any test you can do in a lab that will prove God exists? Can you prove that God doesn't exist? When God created the heavens and the earth, did he create the heavens and the earth to be millions of years old? Billions of years old? I mean, when he created Adam and Eve, were they newborns? No. They were full-grown adults. So he created the heavens and the earth to be billions and millions of years old. So of course, when science tests carbon dating and other things, it's going to show up certain things. Why? Because God made them that age. That's not a problem for people of faith. But that's the basis upon which atheists, a lot of times they believe what they believe because they think science or their facts disprove the existence of God. And as Dewey points out here, even atheists, they cannot disprove the existence of God. Therefore, their belief that there is no God is a faith in itself. Okay? It's their interpretation of facts based on how they view the world with lacking a God, and then they put their faith or their trust in that, and they're really gambling, aren't they? Because if there is a God, they're going to spend eternity regretting not having looked into it. In fact, was it Benjamin Franklin, the preacher in the 1800s, that said that if I'm wrong and there's not a God, I'll never know it. But if you're wrong and there is a God, you'll spend eternity knowing it. And I think that's a really good point. So he goes on to say, this philosophy of naturalism is not by any stretch of the imagination a proven scientific fact. It is faith. People exercise faith daily and constantly. The basic idea of faith is trust. And we trust people and circumstances every day. Anytime we use our hands to feel, our eyes to see, and our minds to think, we have faith that our senses accurately perceive reality. We trust that our parents are who they say they are. We trust that gravity, of which we can only see the effects, we can't really test for it, will keep us on the ground. Juries trust that the evidence leads them to a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. Faith is as much a part of our lives as breathing. We cannot function without it. No one can, and those who deny this are fooling none but themselves. Thoughts or comments so far? I think it's a really good point to show the universality of faith, that everybody has faith. It may not be faith in Jehovah or in Jesus, but everybody utilizes faith. And as he says, kind of the most basic fundamental element of faith is trust. Okay, Abraham, when he says he believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness, don't you think that kind of the main focus of that belief was that he trusted that God would do what he said he would do? He believed God capable, and when God promised him a son, Abraham trusted in that. All right, moving on. There is nothing inherently gullible or blind about faith. And when we consider the fact that the Bible warns against being gullible, we learn that biblical faith is neither blind nor unreasonable. Proper faith rests securely upon the evidence God has provided for us. In the situation of Thomas in John chapter 20, the irony is that he was not being the most reasonable when he refused to believe the witnesses who saw Jesus alive again. I will not believe is not in itself a reasonable statement, especially if our worldview has shut the door to the possibility that there might be greater forces at work than what our limited sight can envision. And this is actually coming up to be really important, especially in the realm of physics and quantum mechanics. There's a whole lot of articles coming out with new molecules that they've detected and new laws that they didn't even anticipate before that they've discovered and so forth in the quantum realm. And they're uncovering all of these things. And every time they do, they think they've got a handle on it. They think that they've got a handle on how all these things work. And then they come up with something else, something new they've detected, something else they can't quite figure out how it works. And so it's like science, the realm of the universe is constantly surprising scientists and physicists and so forth. And of course, it's going to continue to do so. Never will our scientists figure everything out, because God's work is at the heart of it. But the bottom line is that in many ways, just as he points out in this situation, the reasonableness of the statement, "I will not believe," is not based on any other than the fact that Thomas himself didn't see it. He had no reason to discount that the other apostles did. And again, we can speculate, well, maybe Thomas is chalking it up to grief, a grief-stricken hallucination or whatever, but really there's no explanation given why Thomas says that. It's just, unless I get to see him, I will not believe. Well, the other apostles did see him, and they said, "We saw him." And of course, the point that John brings out to us, and that even Jesus brings out to us, is that there's going to be a whole host of all the generations going forward after that generation will have to believe based on eyewitness testimony, because Jesus won't physically appear to us. We believe those who are eyewitnesses who did see him. Anything through that paragraph?
Well, I think you just have to remember that he was grieving. People
Yeah.
say things when they're grieving.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But I do think it's about us believing without seeing.
Without seeing.
That's the encouraging part of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, and he even brings up, I mean, and there's a whole myriad of things that we can't see, but we observe by nature. Okay, gravity is one of the examples he brings up. And there's a whole host of other things that we don't see, but we either know it exists because of other things, or we infer its existence. And these things are accepted in the scientific community because these are the only explanations that explain what we observe. Well, when you've got a design of a universe, of a world, and of a human being, of life itself, that defies explanation through chance, then what you come to, the most reasonable explanation, is a designer. Anything else through this paragraph? Yes, sir.
Thomas's experience actually just adds another level of evidence to it. The others were just witnesses. He has a tactile sensation
Yeah.
of the scars that Jesus had. So, I mean, yes, he's an eyewitness as well at that point, but I mean, it's compounded with more physical evidence.
Sure. And Jesus even offered, and that kind of goes, that's part of the reason why John records this particular event, is because remember, in John's time in the late 90s AD, he's dealing with false teaching that Jesus did not come in the flesh. And what did Jesus offer to Thomas? You can touch me. Okay, feel the holes in my hand. Okay, Jesus wouldn't have offered it if Thomas would have reached right through him as if he was just a hologram or apparition or something. Jesus was flesh and blood, and that's one of the reasons why Jesus showed that, and the reason why John recorded it for us. All right, moving on. What is necessary in order to have a reasonable saving faith? What does the Bible show us with respect to faith? First, reasonable faith has some level of understanding. So he cross-references or references Acts 17, 22 through 31. So why does he, because he talks about it a little bit, but what's the point of Acts 17, 22 through 31? Okay, so remember, of course, we've talked before about Paul started where they were with their false gods, but he utilized the opportunity because just in case the Athenians had missed one, they had included an altar to the unknown God. And so Paul says, let me tell you about the unknown God. And so he began there and taught to them about Jehovah. Dowie goes on to say, when Paul went into the city of Athens, he began where they were with their gods. Page 17. He then proceeded to explain to them the true God of heaven and earth. If we are going to have a proper faith, we must believe that God is, going back to Hebrews 11, verse 6, but this implies that we have some level of understanding about who God is. And I think this is a very important point as well. Just because I believe that there is a God, does that in and of itself teach me what I need to know? Or tell me in any way, inform me in any way what I need to know? Okay, I need to know who God is and what He wants of me. Okay, I can believe there's a God, but until I know the character of the one true God, Jehovah, I'm never going to come to an understanding of what He wants for me and how I can be saved. Second, reasonable. So what was the first? Reasonable faith is based on what? Understanding. Okay. Secondly, reasonable faith requires that we have a reason for accepting what we believe. In other words, faith is not just some willy-nilly think whatever you wish whim, but is grounded on objective evidence and testimony. Peter wrote that we must sanctify Christ as Lord and always be ready to give a defense of our hope. We cannot offer a defense or a reason for the hope within if we have no reason for it to begin with. And this applies even to some of the specifics regarding what God says is right and wrong, how churches are set up, how they're to worship. Okay, the specifics of having a reason for accepting what is true goes from the general about Jehovah and about Jesus all the way to the specifics, which kind of paints a certain light. In fact, part of what we're talking about this morning, we're finishing up our thoughts from last week on whether there's still law today. And one of the things that the new hermeneutic crowd that they think is that the Bible really, it's more just a love letter from God to man, informing man about how much He loves us. But it's more guidelines. It's just kind of not. Don't get bogged down into the details. And while I agree that in many ways, yes, God's love is on display in the Old and New Testament, showing us the full plan of salvation, there's also the conditions upon which we must meet, upon which our salvation is based. And to believe that, well, God, you just accept Jesus into your heart and you'll be saved, or just accept that the Bible's just kind of a set of guidelines willy-nilly, it ignores. It kind of picks and chooses the evidence it wants, rather than taking the whole. So, as he quotes Peter for 1 Peter 3:15, he says, we cannot offer defense for a reason for the hope within us if we have no reason for it to begin with. Third, biblical faith requires a willingness to act. Of course, James chapter 2 deals with that extensively. Faith without what is dead? Works. Okay, if you believe, but you're not willing to do anything or obey anything, then it's a dead faith. It's not a living faith. So when he says, James informs us that faith involves the mind or intellect, the emotions, and the will to act. Even the demons believed. There's an intellectual understanding, an intellectual acceptance. The demons believed, and what did they do? They trembled. Now, trembling, fear, is an emotional response, is it not? Okay, when the Jews on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 were pricked in their hearts, does that not imply an emotional response, a conviction to what they're hearing? And of course, they asked, men and brethren, what shall we do? Okay, they wanted to address that issue. They wanted to do something about it. The demons believe and they tremble. Why do they tremble? They know the power of Jehovah. And even more, they know the consequence that awaits them for serving Satan. But who will argue, as Dewey goes on to say here, who will argue that they were saved? James argued that a person of faith must act, and that takes an act of the will. Any thoughts through that third point?
I just keep thinking about, all the people in Hollywood or whatever. I think everybody probably in their life has gone through, why was I born, why was I here, but, what am I here to do, and you have, even people of the world will say there is a higher power, that's just our nature.
Yeah.
To want to worship or nationalities conceded that Jehovah,
Yeah.
God of Israel, is powerful and he's the best God. We just studied about one of those the other day. And then, it shows us the nature of God. The Bible shows us the nature of God.
Right.
You have a nature in us to want to worship. You have examples of where God overpowered other gods. And so, and we know God is true to his word.
Mm-hmm.
And so, with all of that in there, it's like, how could you not?
Right. Right.
People are making up their own religions
Yeah.
because they want to worship something.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yep. That's
But
true.
Their documents are not going to hold true the way our document does.
Yeah.
Their documents haven't lasted as long as our documents. Our document doesn't have the historical credentials or backing.
Right.
Their documents can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yep.
then you have the secular history that lines up with what the Bible says.
Mhm.
So you've got more than one proof. It's not one man under a tree.
Right. And it doesn't contradict itself, whereas many of man's own created documents does.
And it hasn't changed. And
Yeah.
many religions today, like, I was listening to something the other day and said, well, they changed their take on homosexuality or whatever it was, and now we're going to be accepting of everybody. I'm like,
They just change it.
no.
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
Yep.
The Bible hasn't changed. And God's nature doesn't change.
That's right.
It's who he is.
Yeah. That's part of what he says in Malachi chapter 3. I am the Lord, I changeth not.
Yeah.
Yeah. All
Aren't
right.
we glad?
Huh?
Aren't we glad?
Yes, absolutely. All right, so the first basis of biblical faith is understanding. The second that he brings up is having a reason for accepting what we believe, which goes to evidence. And then the third is a willingness to act, therefore, on the reasons why we believe what we believe. Anything else through that paragraph? Also important is understanding what faith does not require. Faith involves making a conscious decision about what we cannot see. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 18 is mentioned. And of course, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 18. In a context of persecution, what does Paul say? What does Paul describe in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 18? We look at the things that are unseen, not at the things which you can see. For the things that are unseen are eternal. The things which are seen are not eternal. They're physical. He describes how that the flesh passes away and so forth. All right. We can do this with evidence and reason. And even though we need some level of understanding, faith does not require that we know all there is to know about the subject, or that we understand all the whys and wherefores about it. Most of us will not understand everything there is to know about cars or computers, but that does not stop us from using them. We need some understanding of God, but this does not suggest that we can know or understand all there is to know about God. I think that's a really good point, because there are going to be things that people bring up that really aren't going to have an answer. Okay? What happens when we die? Well, we have some examples and some references to the soul going to paradise or going to torment and so forth. But exactly what that's like, I can't tell you that. The occasion where Jesus was having a conversation with Legion, there was these legion of angels that were inside this person, and they begged Jesus to cast them into the swine and not cast them into the abyss. That is a very unique term, the abyss. And it suggests that it's some kind of a spiritual realm type of reference. I don't know what the abyss is, but the demons were terrified of it. They didn't want to be cast in that. They'd rather go into the swine and jump off a cliff and drown than to be cast into this abyss. I don't know what that's about. There's not a lot of extrapolation on that. But what are we given? What does Peter say we've been given? All things that pertain to everything about God?
Life and godliness.
All things that pertain to life and godliness. I mean, God has revealed to us what we need to know. There's going to be some things that we just don't know. In fact, Job was challenged by God. You think you're so wise to question my wisdom? Well, where were you, Job? And of course, what did Job conclude in Job chapter 42? I have asked these questions, things that are too wonderful for me to know. I repent in sackcloth and ashes. Okay, Job recognized that there are some things you're not going to know. Sometimes there are things going to happen in this world that we may not have a reason why. But, I mean, obviously, good can come from even the worst situations that do take place. But when people ask, well, why did God allow the pandemic to take place? Well, I can't answer that. I do know that it reminds us, first of all, that this earth is temporary, and that in heaven there's not going to be any pandemics, that's for sure. But beyond that, I don't have all the answers for that.
But so many times, men have to suffer the consequences of their decisions.
That's right.
So when we say, why did God let it happen? So we made it happen.
Yeah.
You know, and he tells us, I'm not going to step in and do a miracle,
Well, and he's not going to infringe man's free will.
Right, exactly.
You know, whether it's a natural event or it's an event that man is behind, no matter what it is, it's just another reminder that this world is temporary. This world is full of difficulty and sorrow at times. Heaven is not like that. But this just goes back to show that there's always going to be questions. Okay, and as Doy points out, one thing that faith does not require is a complete and full understanding of everything that has to do with anything about God, because we're not going to have that. Especially, and he brings up Romans 11, 30 through 34 as well, especially since he is even capable of doing far more than we can even think, Ephesians 3:20. I think that's a great reference to bring up, because Paul mentions that God is able to do even more than we can even think to ask. And you think about just the depth of wisdom, the depth of knowledge, of complete understanding that God has. You and I are never going to have that type of understanding in this life anyway. We are finite, necessarily limited by time and space. So faith does not mean that we have figured everything out that is possible. Faith requires humility, an acknowledgement that we are not the final authority on life and reality. Someone much greater exists upon whom we must rely. Anything through that paragraph? Now, I think that's a good point to bring up, because people are going to try to use that as questioning why you have faith in Jehovah. Well, what about this and what about this? And, well, tell me how this works. Well, I can't tell you how that works. There are just some things we don't know. But what we do know is necessary for salvation. It's what God has given us so that we may be saved. Noah?
It's just interesting. There are some people who seem to thrive on dealing with, the questions, the unknowns, the stuff on the fringes, so to speak. I think it's Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord.
Yeah.
And I've often tried to. Why don't we act on what we do know we can understand?
Right.
At least start there, but they come across, I can't know everything.
Right.
All these questions answered, I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it makes me think of a parent-child relationship, which we are in that.
Yeah.
a lot. And kids think their parents know it all, and so they just have trust and faith, and they look to their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And aren't we so blessed that we can do that with our God? And we don't have to have all the answers, because we know that He does.
Yeah.
And I'm going to trust Him because He is who He is. Just like a child, especially a small child, trust their parents, want their parents when they're scared, believe their parents are going to always take care of them and prefer themselves.
Yeah.
And that's the relationship that we can have, is that childlike belief and faith in that person that has your back.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good analogy. Yeah. Anything else to that paragraph? All right, on the nature of evidence, page 18. We've already illustrated the nature of evidence by appealing to a courtroom setting where the jury assesses the evidence and makes a decision. Whatever they decide will necessarily involve faith. The point, though, is that the nature of evidence conforms to the nature of reason. Virtually any idea that we hold as a conviction is, at least in our minds, beyond a reasonable doubt. What that means is that we begin to consider doubt to be unreasonable along the way to our acceptance of a position, which is to say that eventually the evidence outweighs everything else. You come to a conclusion and say, I no longer have any doubt because I'm persuaded by the evidence that is given. Most accept that their parents really are their parents without feeling the need to scientifically verify it. Is it reasonable to trust that our parents are who they say they are? Must we have further proof in order for this to be reasonable? Okay, you just accept that on the basis of the fact that your parents say you're your parents, you grew up. Now, are there occasions where parents may be not biologically their parents? Sure. But the reasonable expectation, the reasonable conclusion for most people is that when my parent says they're my parent, they're my parent. I've been raised with that idea that they're my parent. It's reasonable. How do we know that anything has happened in history? How do we know that we didn't just pop into existence 5 minutes ago, complete with a false memory? Really, how do we know? Silly, one may think, but the fact is that whatever we believe about the past is going to be based upon faith. How do we know that George Washington was the first president of the United States? Or that Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome? Or that Alexander the Great pushed his forces to the edge of India? We accept these matters on faith. We'll stop here for a second. How so? Because historians would reject that completely. Oh, no, it's not faith.
Well, we have to trust that what they said is true.
Okay, so what do we base our trust in about George Washington being the first president? Historical evidence, right? We based our trust in those historical proofs. And that's his point. It's still trust because were you an eyewitness to George Washington? Keith was. But was anybody else an eyewitness to George Washington being first president? No. Or Julius Caesar being assassinated in Rome? That was before Keith's time. Or Alexander the Great? No. We base our faith and trust in history on the historical documents. That's why we say these things happened. And that's the point that he makes. We accept these matters on faith, and for the most part, believe it would be unreasonable to doubt them because the evidence leads us to that conclusion. But do we realize that there is as much or more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus than there is for the other ancient historical people? Remember we talked before about the Iliad and all these ancient documents for which there may be a couple hundred copies. Okay, and some of these other historical individuals like Josephus, who only has a handful of fragments and copies, but Josephus is taken as a historian. Okay, a lot of the stuff that he writes is taken as literal history, even though his history is biased, but based on his perspective as a Jew. But that being the case, okay, these things are taken as fact, generally speaking. But compared to the Bible, we have thousands of copies, thousands of manuscripts that all say virtually the same thing. And that's what his point is. We have more documents and more fragments and more copies of the New Testament. Let's just go with the New Testament, not even the Old Testament, the New Testament, than we do of George Washington being the first president. And when you think about that logically and reasonably, that's astounding when you think about that. But it's true. Typically, apologetics, a system of defense, breaks down into three primary categories: scientific, philosophical, and historical. We will be considering evidence in all of these categories. Scientific evidences appeal to what we can learn from the nature of our world and universe. For example, the cosmological argument for God's existence. Philosophical evidence appeals to logic and reason, recognizing that God gave us rational minds to think and reason on matters that cannot be empirically verified. For example, the problem of evil and suffering. The question that, well, why is there evil? Why does God let evil and so forth? That's more of a philosophical discussion. And of course, as he talked about scientific, which discusses the cosmological, the universe, the design of everything. And then historical evidence appeals to the objective testimony that is open to investigation. The ancient documents and eyewitness accounts that tell us, for example, about the resurrection of Jesus. Together, these areas of evidence give us the warrant to confidently assert our faith in Jesus as Lord and the Bible as His Word. Faith has consequences for eternity. We don't give up our intellect when we choose to believe. Rather, we use our intellect to inform our faith so that in the final analysis, God will be glorified. And I think that's a really important point to make too, because there's a lot of people in our world that view people of faith as ignorant, backwoods, uneducated, unintelligent. And I think his point is very valid when he says that we don't give up our intellect when we choose to believe. Because belief isn't just something we concoct on our own. It's informed by evidence. Thoughts or questions through those? All right. Let's hit our discussion questions real quick. Do you have something? Okay. Why is faith necessary to live life? And I put page numbers here next to each one just so, in case you have trouble figuring it out, where it's at and so forth. This is on page 16 primarily. Why is faith necessary to live life? Not just from the perspective of a Christian, but from the perspective of a human being.
Well, I sure don't understand how engine works, but I'm sure I'm glad it works.
Yeah. You trust that engine will work, right? Individuals who are experts, a doctor that you go to, you trust that their expertise is going to inform you of what you need to do to get better.
I trust my bank's not going to steal my money.
You trust your bank that digital money in there is going to stay there, right? Okay? And just as he said, in every aspect of life, trust is a key component, and it doesn't matter what it is. Everybody has faith in something. They trust in someone or something every day, whether it's God or not. Faith exists in life, and it is necessary to live life. Anybody else have anything else they want to add to question 1? Question 2. How is faith tied to evidence? And of course, he links John 20 and Matthew 11 on pages 14 and 15 here. How is faith tied to evidence? Is faith completely disconnected from any consideration of fact or evidence? Do I just believe in what I want to believe?
John ties them directly. These things are written that you might believe.
Okay.
For that purpose, to that end.
In fact, John even says there were many other things that Jesus did, didn't he? In fact, in the 3 years that he preached between the 4 Gospels, we only have a small sliver of those 3 years. Not to mention the 30 years before that, where we only have even a smaller amount of what Jesus was like. We have when he was 12, he was in the temple. But what was Jesus like as a teenager? I know he never sinned, which is unbelievable. It's amazing. It's not unbelievable. It's believable. But it's amazing. But Jesus was a teenager. Okay? There's a whole lot we don't have. But do we need that stuff to believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God? Do we need that information as it pertains to life and godliness? No, what we have, what we need. And that's why John says there were many other things Jesus did. But these things are written so that you will believe that Jesus is Christ, Son of God, believing you may have life in His name. And of course, Matthew chapter 11. What's brought up? What did Doy talk about with Matthew chapter 11? That's back on page 15.
John was in prison as soon as the disciples were inquiring about it. Jesus wasn't the Messiah.
And then Jesus said what? Basically, look at the works that I do. Okay, in the presence of those disciples of John, Jesus showed that the lame are made whole, or made to walk, the deaf can hear, the blind can see, and that all fulfilled prophecy, those works speak. Those works provide evidence. And so this wasn't some baseless idea. It's all based in truth, based in fact, based in eyewitness testimony. Anything else to question 2?
Jesus could have given a statement, or here's your paragraph, I am the expected one,
Yeah.
period, bow down or whatever.
Believe me or whatever.
No, he doesn't answer it directly, so to speak.
Yeah.
Faith is an individual thing. You say the evidence is there, look at it. We're expected to use some reasoning and logic and come to a conclusion.
Right. Right. Absolutely. All right. Question 3. What is biblical faith, and why is this sometimes misunderstood? What is biblical faith in a nutshell?
Believing in God
Believing in God.
and living your life to please Him.
Okay. Living your life to please Him. I believe in God just because I want to believe in God? Okay. So I believe, I have an understanding about Jehovah from His Word, right? And I have a reasonable reason to believe these things because of the eyewitness testimony, and therefore I am going to act on that conviction. And that's why he describes biblical faith, that it's not just limited to simply trust, that this is, I understand who Jehovah is based on what he tells me. I believe what he tells me because of eyewitness testimony to the fact that he exists and that Jesus was raised and all that. And then I act on it. That is biblical faith. Whereas sometimes it's misunderstood to be what? Gullible, unreasonable, ignorant. But that's not the case. Anything through question 3? Question 4. What is necessary for reasonable faith? And that goes back, in fact, Tammy just mentioned it. The idea of having understanding, that's reasonable faith. Having the basis for understanding in eyewitness testimony or evidence, and then leading that to act. Okay? And then what is not necessary for reasonable faith, very quickly, number 5? A full knowledge. Okay? I don't have to know everything there is to know about God. I don't have to know everything there is to know about Jesus' 33 years of life. What I do know is what God has provided for me. And God says, this is what you need. You don't need the rest of it. Maybe we can ask God when we get to heaven with, the questions that we don't have answers to. The dinosaurs, did they exist before the flood, or did God just create their bones? I don't know. I mean, the depictions of Leviathan and the behemoth in Job sound similar to certain types of dinosaurs. It's possible they existed before the flood, but I don't know. Does it matter? Is that going to, either way, I think if God created them before or they existed before the flood, does it matter? Nope. All right. So that's the end of chapter 1. Like I said, chapter 2, we will not read every single paragraph. We're just going to overview, and then we'll hit the discussion questions, and I'll have an outline, Lord willing, on Wednesday for everybody to pick up for that. So read your books between now and Sunday. There are more books on the back chair in here. If you haven't gotten a book for Mind Your Faith, go ahead and pick one up, put your name in it, take it home, whatnot. We've got more books, so don't feel like you can only take one for your family or whatever. You can take one for yourself too. Thanks, everybody.